Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. We are right at the top of the hour. And so we're going to get started with this live webinar. Top 10 best practices for your vendor master file to avoid fraud, fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So we'll talk about how you can mitigate fraud risk, how you can be in compliance with regulatory requirements, and have accurate vendor data using these best practices. And there is a bonus tip at the end. Now, some housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording within 3 days. Most likely it will be tomorrow about this same time. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. They will be saved for the Q&A session during the last up to 15 minutes of this presentation. And if I don't get to all of your questions, you can certainly email me and I'll provide that on the question slide at any time. And don't forget to download the handouts in the handout section. There are 4 downloads, a PDF of the presentation. I do have a copy of my brochure. And then there is a 2021 training schedule for some training I'll talk about a little later. And then there's also a vendor validation reference list with resource links that we'll also talk about. Now, for those of you that are attending one of my monthly webinars for the first time, I do want to introduce myself. I am Debra R. Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. As a previous AP senior manager, I was responsible for maintaining 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. So yes, that is 7 vendor master files. Now I work with accounts payable and procurement teams to clean up their data, clean up their vendor processes so they can pay the right vendor. And I do want you to check out my site. I have both free and paid content, several free downloads, a blog, putting the AP in Happy podcast, coming up on the 135th episode. And both of those have actionable items like I will share here today on this webinar. And I also have some trainings for team members and the team that I will talk about as well. Now, let's review the agenda. We will first look at the my three-step proprietary vendor setup and maintenance process, authentication, validation, and management. And then we'll look at the top 10 best practices divided based on the those three steps, authentication, validation, and management. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session, again, up to 15 minutes. Okay. But first, we are going to start with a poll question. Let me go ahead and get this launched. So what I really would like to know is who owns the vendor master file? Is it accounts payable? Is it procurement? Is it master data governance? Is it split between 2 groups? And I've seen that happen sometimes as well. Or is it some other department? Now, usually what I typically see, and also based on the last survey that I've seen from IOFM, an accounts payable organization, is that accounts payable has it about 74% of the time. Procurement has it about 24% of the time, and then 2% have it in other groups, which could be master data governance or some other group. So let's see what we have on this call today, or on this webinar today. I'll give you about 15 or 10 more seconds to answer, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the results. and continue with the presentation. So 5 more seconds. Go ahead and vote if you haven't already voted. And I am going to go ahead and close out the poll, and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so who owns the vendor master file? So it looks like 50% of you that are on the phone or on the call identified that accounts payable. So 50% accounts payable. 14 or the next one is 21% is split between groups, and then sharing 14% each is procurement and master data governance. Okay, so it looks like it's a little bit more spread out than the last survey I saw. So everyone that's on the call, whether you're accounts payable, procurement, master data governance, or some other groups, welcome. Let's get started talking about the vendor master file and some top 10 best practices. So let me get back to. All right, so we are going to start off again with my proprietary authentication validation management process that I use for my clients that still have manual or fully manual vendor processes to ensure real vendors and avoid, again, that fraud and regulatory fines. Okay, so the first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. So the data source is who is sending. The delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. So if you guys have, any of you have a vendor portal, then you would authenticate utilizing the vendor portal because the login credentials, and hopefully you have MFA, that login process will authenticate the vendor. Now, step 2 is validation, where you validate vendor data before it is entered into your ERP. Now, I do have as one of your downloads a vendor validation reference list with resource links. It has over 25 validations, and we'll talk about some of those today, that you can check to see if you're doing those, and if you're not, take a look at those and see if there's something that one of the validations or some of the validations that you can add to your current process. And if you have a vendor portal, keep in mind that whatever validations that vendor portal doesn't do, because some of them will have validations automatically included, because they do have APIs for some of those. Whatever the portal does not have, your team needs to make up, and so you can also utilize this reference list. Okay. Now, the third step is management, where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file on a consistent basis, and I do mean consistent basis. So inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with in 15, 18, or 24 months, and then checking for duplicate vendors and revalidating active vendor data to make sure there are no changes, and just making sure they've not been added to a watch list since you originally set them up or modified them last. Now, I do have an e-guide that includes 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and 13 plus best practices. And it's 66 pages with nothing but actionable items. I didn't include stories. I didn't include any fluff. It's just, here's what you do. And that e-guide really goes through the authentication validation management process. And I do have a discount code at the end of the presentation, so you can get it at 25% off. All right, so now that you know what the best practices are based on, let's start looking at what I consider to be the top 10. All right, so we're going to start with best practices for authentication, because this is where it all starts. Verify who you are getting the vendor information from to add or change existing data in your vendor master file, and then also authenticating the data. So let's take a look at the first best practice. So best practice number one is to authenticate the requester. So you need to authenticate the requester, whether they are a vendor or an employee submitting documents on behalf of the vendor. And you can do that by asking 2 or 3 identifying questions. And this process should sound familiar to you, as this is what your banks do, for example, or your bank does when you call in to make changes or get information on your account. So your bank does it to you, you should do it to your vendor and your internal employees. So for vendors, you need to, again, have 2 to 3 identifying questions, and I would have 4 or 5 or more to choose from so that the same questions are not asked each time. Another critical key is to make sure you're not asking for elements on the same document, and that's the reason for the different columns here. So for example, you don't want to ask for an invoice number and an invoice date, since that information is on the same document. Better is to ask for an invoice number and the last 4 digits of the tax ID, or for a valid purchase order number and the last 4 digits of the existing bank account. Now, for new vendors, you can ask for the buyer or name of the employee that requested their service, plus maybe a contract number or an invoice number if it's non-PO and maybe they've already invoiced you. You may be asking, though, what if the vendor pushes back because they don't have the correct information? So if you are dealing with a vendor employee that does not have the correct information to answer those questions, then my question back to you would be, why is that vendor employee requesting a change in the first place? Especially if it's a banking change, since we know that's one of the biggest risks out there for fraudulent payments, is making a payment to a changed bank account that a fraudster has submitted. So do you really want to make a change to a vendor's existing bank account if the request is based on a vendor's employee that does not have the capability to access the existing banking information? You really must wonder if they really have the authority to make the change, or if they are who they say they are. Now, for internal employees, yes, you may need to authenticate employees if your email system does not flag emails as external, which I know a lot of your companies out there do that. But especially in this past year with the pandemic and everyone working from home and those technological issues that we had in the beginning with getting set up, a lot of employees were emailing from their personal accounts and also calling in not from the company phone system, but from their cell phones. So you want to do the same thing. Request confirmation of 2 to 3 validations that only the employee would know, and that the accounts payable or procurement help desk team has access to. So for example, you could use their next level up, their cubicle number, maybe what's included on your company intranet pages. Now, you also want to limit the information that you can reveal and confirm only. For example, you never want to give them the tax ID. Confirm that only by asking them the last 4 or 5 digits. Now, this reference template, I do have a reference template, and it can be a critical step in preventing fraud. Again, as we continue remote working, and it is included with the e-guide, but you can also take a screenshot of this or use the one from the PDF presentation and create your own. But I do recommend that you review all of the elements that I have included, identify which ones will work for your company, and then add additional ones as necessary. So make sure you customize this reference template. And again, if you want to get this one that's included with the e-guide, I will have a discount code at the end of the presentation. All right, best practice number 2 is authenticate the data for banking changes. So I do recommend that companies have a company branded ACH form. And what I recommend you include on the form is that you require authenticating data on that form. So my recommendation is to require the existing banking details or the last 3 payments with deposit dates and amounts. And again, if they do not have the existing banking details, do you really want to accept that documentation from that vendor's employee or purporting to be from the vendor? Do you really want to accept new banking information if they don't know the existing banking information? I also recommend that you require the full tax ID, again, more authenticating data. And this can actually help you out too, because it'll help make sure your vendor team is updating the right vendor record. And then if you have any unique element that your company has, that your uses, that your vendor knows, then you can add that as well. And then optional but recommended, the remit address, the vendor ID. And I say that because some systems out there like PeopleSoft can have multiple locations that are based on remit addresses, and you want to make sure you're using or updating the right one. And then again, if your company has a unique element, you can make that optional instead of required. Now, best practice for that branded ACH form is to make sure you change it every year. And if you do that, then when you authenticate the requester and send them that that company branded ACH form, the most updated version, you know that if you're getting in company branded ACH forms from previous years, that you really haven't authenticated, that you actually have not authenticated the requester first because they sent you an old form, and that can be a red flag for fraud. Also, do not post it on a company website. Again, same thing. You want to make sure that you authenticate the requesters before you give them that form for to update or to submit an update to their banking. Okay. All right, so that was number 2. And at that, we're going to get to our second poll question. And this actually is leading up to our validations part, or our top best practices for validations. And so what I'd like to know is if you are validating bank account ownership. So I've launched a poll. Go ahead and answer. If you are, yes. If you are not, no. And if you're not quite sure if that's being done, I know we did have 14% that answered that. You've got 2 different departments splitting the vendor master file function, and so maybe the other department might be responsible for validations, might not know what they're doing, if they're doing that or not. So go ahead and click not sure, but if you know you are, yes. If you know you are not, select no. So I'll give this about 10 more seconds. Go ahead and vote if you have not voted yet. All right, so I am going to go ahead. We've got most folks have already voted, so I am going to go ahead and close this poll, and we'll look at the results. Okay, so it looks like, wow, we have 50% are validating bank account ownership. That's actually really great. It's higher than I ever thought that was going to be. So that's good. And then 33% are no, and then 17% are not sure. Okay, so I do have best practice when it comes to banking. I don't know if it's the next one, but it's great to know what the folks on the call are doing. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this, and we're going to get back to our presentation. All right, so best practices, validation. So once you authenticate the vendor and the data, now you need to validate the data before you put that information into your vendor master file, before you update your vendor master file with that information. But before you set up a new vendor or update an existing vendor, the vendor team needs to search for duplicate vendors. And so I've made this best practice number 3. You want to confirm that the vendor does not already have a vendor record in your vendor master file. Duplicate vendors can be an indicator of fraud, and you know they can result in duplicate payments. You want to search not just by tax ID or their legal name. You want to search by legal name, tax ID, and by address. So all 3, because you never know what may reveal that that duplicate vendor. Make sure your team and your internal employees searching in your system know how to search for vendors in your particular accounting system or ERP, because each has different or specific wildcards. Maybe you use short names. Identify what that search process is, put it in a one-pager for your vendor team and for your internal team members trying to figure out if vendors already exist, because you want to prevent them from unnecessarily collecting or sending vendors instructions on how to register if they already exist. And the team, both internal and your vendor team, needs to know how to find those duplicate vendors if they exist. All right, so best practice number 4. Now, this one may hit home because some of you may still be receiving those 1099s and 1042s that you sent out back in February and March. And so address status is a great best practice. US and international addresses, you can use Smarty Streets. Smarty Streets validates, standardizes, and gives you the address status. Now, you may already know this, but when you do a lookup on USPS, they actually do have the status of the address. It's just not returned with the results. But Smarty Streets will give you the status, and they will tell you whether that vendor address is inactive, vacant, or if it's only a PO box, which you know that also can be an indicator of fraud, because fraudsters hide behind PO boxes. They don't have a street address. And so this best practice is something that I use when I do the vendor master file cleanups for my clients. And this is especially good to do before you send out all those 1099s and 1042s next year, so you don't get them back. Now, best practice number 5 is a global vendor registration number. So it's not just about the IRS tax ID for US vendors. Other countries have income tax registration numbers, sales tax registration numbers. They also have individual identity and business identity registration numbers. The top 5 trading partner countries with the US is Canada, Mexico, China, United Kingdom, and Japan. And each of those countries have registration numbers that you can use to either validate that it's valid with your vendor's legal name, or not all of the countries have each of their global registration numbers or each of their registration numbers. They don't all have a validation resource, but do have a format, and so you can validate the format. Now, the vendor validation reference list, which is a download in your handouts, it is a reference that has broken down like the 25 plus validations based on the document type that you can get the information from. So once you download this from the handouts, you will be able to click on that resource link and go to that resource. And if you feel that's something you need to add to your current validations, please do that. But the point with this best practice is you need to make sure you know the global registration numbers or the registration numbers for the countries that your vendors are in. So run a report on, if you don't know, lots of my clients will say they don't have international vendors, but once they give me their vendor master file, they do have international vendors. So if you think you don't, or if you don't know how many you have, or you don't know what countries are included, make sure you run a report and that you include the country column, you include the state column, because sometimes the country will be put in the state as 2 digits, and identify which countries you have vendors in and make sure that you're checking those registration numbers as well. Now, the next one, best practice number 6, you probably knew this was coming. It's the watch list. So OFAC, where if vendors appear on this list, they really should not be set up in your vendor master file, because compliance with OFAC regulations is required for all U.S. individuals and entities, and failure to comply can result in both civil and criminal penalties, which are more substantial than the IRS penalties and fines. So if you're not doing OFAC, make sure you get that done. If most of you are using TIN Check, I probably should have asked that as a poll question, tincheck.com, it's already included. But if you're using irs.gov e-services, make sure for your IRS TIN Match, make sure you're also utilizing or doing a search on the OFAC resource. And I do have that as a resource link on that vendor validation reference list. The next one is system of award management. So governments and federal healthcare systems are prohibited from awarding contracts to contractor entities that are on this exclusion list. And the Office of Inspector General, so OIG, they have the authority to exclude individuals and entities from federally funded healthcare programs. So the watch list can be dependent on what type of company or governmental entity or federal healthcare system, or so it can be based on the type of company you are. As well. So make sure that you understand all of the watch lists that affect your particular company. And again, each of these watch lists are a resource on that vendor validation reference list. All right, so now if you or your team members need assistance with the W-9 and or the tincheck.com validations, based on the W-9, here's some paid resources. I have 2 trainings and an ebook to train you and your team. I typically get a lot of questions about the validations at the bottom of the tincheck.com results, because no one ever knows what to do if they're red, or if they need to do anything if they're red. And so that's kind of where the top training session came from. So check out my website if you're interested in any of these. Okay. Now, best practice number 7. So this is includes that poll question I had about bank account ownership, but it's not the only thing. So best practice number 7 is banking validations. So the ABA routing, the SWIFT, the BIC, you want to confirm that ACH or wire payments are processed successfully. This is key to ensure that the correct ABA routing number is used for the right type of payment, because most of you probably probably already know, there can be separate routing numbers for ACH and wire payments. The validation also confirms that the routing number matches the bank stated on the supporting documentation, eliminating potential fraud. And then if you, same with non-US banks or international banks, where if they do not have an IBAN, they will have a SWIFT or a BIC code along with the bank account number. And I will also, say for bank mergers and acquisitions, this is one of the most missed areas in your vendor master file as well with existing vendors, because banks merged or get acquired often. The last one I am aware of, and I believe it was either early this year or late last year, was BB&T and SunTrust. They merged to a new bank called Truist, and that new bank has a new routing number. So how many vendors in your system, in your vendor master file, is using BB&T and SunTrust routing numbers? And now those are incorrect. And you know what happens if you make a payment to those vendors, you send that pay file off to the bank, they'll probably change it for you for the first few times. They'll send you notices, notice of changes or NOCs or NOCs, and they'll tell you to change it. If you don't change it, you could have, you could be liable for a notch fine. So you always want to make sure that you're checking those in your vendor master file as well and getting those updated. Now, the next one is bank account ownership. Now, that is matching the vendor legal name with the bank account holder name and the new account number, and sometimes the tax ID on the vendor record against the tax ID used to open the bank account. Now, the company logos that I have on the screen are what I know are the options for bank account ownership. So early warning and GIAC are for vendors with US banks, because they use a database that US banks voluntarily contribute their depositor information to. They don't get that same cooperation with international banks. But for international banks, NS-Knox, they came up with a solution which is a pre-note process. And since it's not relying on a contribution to a database, they can accommodate international and US vendor banks. So early warning and GIAC are for US banks, and NS-Knox are US banks and international banks because they do a pre-note process. Now, each of these companies are included on the vendor validation reference list. I believe it says you have to have an account, so it lets you know which ones are paid, because it'll say an account is needed. But those resources, those links to those resources are on the vendor validation reference list. So check those out for those 33% or 17% who were not sure if you do bank account ownership validations. Now, the third poll question and the last one, I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And that is, when is the last time you inactivated or deactivated, whatever you call it in your system, your existing vendors? Was that this year, last year, within the last 2 years, never, or maybe you inherited a vendor master file and you're just unsure? So when's the last time you've inactivated or deactivated those existing vendors that you haven't done business with? This year, last year, within the last 2 years, never, or unsure. Go ahead and answer that last poll question. We'll give about 10 more seconds to make sure everybody gets a chance to vote, and then I will share the results. Looks like we have just over half. Go ahead and vote if you haven't voted yet. All right, so it looks like we have most of the folks have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And this time, I think I'm going to share it for real. I thought I had done that before on the last one. Okay, so poll results. This is really great. The biggest percentage is this year. So great. That's looking good because that sometimes that percentage is quite low. 29% are unsure. And then we have a tie of 14% for last year or within the last 2 years. And then a very small percentage, but still a little concerning, is never. And that was 7%. So 7% have never clean their vendor master or inactivated or deactivated their vendors. So we'll talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and hide the poll. And then let's get back to the top 10 best practices. So these next top 10 best practices will be on management of the authentication, validation, management 3-step process. All right, so vendor master file data, maintain accurate data. Best practice number 8 is to send a notification. So for existing vendors in your vendor master file, when you've authenticated the requester, send in the documents. When you have, when the validations are successful and you make a change to their vendor record, you want to send a notification. So when you update your profile on your bank website, on Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, Discovery Plus, Disney Plus, you guys can tell what I did during the pandemic. Anyway, they send you a notification to say that if you did not make the change, to contact them. So you need to do the same thing for your vendors. This notice may mean the difference between being able to recover funds and just being too late, especially if you have to wait for the vendor to miss the payments. And that's still a high percentage of when companies find out that they've made a fraudulent payment is because the vendor is, did not get the payment, they missed the payment, and so they're calling in to ask where that payment is. So if you send them a notification at the time that their remit information has changed, be it their bank account information or their remit address for checks, then they have the opportunity either right when you're making the payment, if you made the change in order to make the payment, or before you sent the payment out to say, hey, I did not make this change. Now, that might seem like a lot of manual work, and it could be, it depends on your system. I have automated this process in SAP where it automatically sent out an email, provided I had an email address for the vendor on file. But in some other systems like PeopleSoft and or smaller systems like NetSuite or Intact, that functionality or ability to add it just wasn't there. And yes, we had to manually send notices. If we had an email address, we sent it via email. If we did not have an email address, we had to send it via regular mail. Okay. Also, the next one, best practice number 9, which was based on that poll question, is what do you do with the vendors to ensure that their information is still up to date, even if you haven't done business with them in a while? The answer to that is you inactivate your vendors. Inactivating the vendors is the first step in what I have as an 8-step process to clean your vendor master file. Inactivating the vendors that have no PO activity, no invoice activity, no payment activity, and I typically throw in vendor record activity because the whole point is keeping their information up to date, and if you've updated their vendor record, then it's up to date. But inactivate those vendors you haven't had activity with in 15, 18, or 24 months, whatever you consider is good for your company. This reduces the number of active vendors, and depending on when you last inactivated, I'm thinking of that 7% that was never, it can be up to a 50% reduction in my experience in the number of active vendors you have in your vendor master file. And the less active vendors means that there are less vendors that are accessible for fraud. Now, when you do business with a vendor in the future, if you do business with them again in the future, treat them as a new vendor and collect all the same required documentation. And that way you can maintain accurate vendor data. Okay. Now, the last one, you want to track performance with key performance indicators. Now, I don't know about you, but every time I see benchmarks for accounts payable activity, they're usually tracking invoice process activities like cost per invoice. Well, there really should be key performance indicators or KPIs for the vendor master file as well, and the vendor process too, for that matter. I was attending a conference a couple of years ago, and there was a very interesting accounts payable team that presented on their improvements in accounts payable. There were multiple team leaders, and I was very excited to hear about the improvements in their vendor maintenance processes from their team lead. Now, after the presentation, I asked if any KPIs specific for vendor maintenance were being tracked, and we both acknowledged a need to identify relevant KPIs. So really, they weren't tracking any. And so what I did is I came up with 25 different KPIs for accounts payable vendor maintenance. I wrote a couple blogs about it. I have a link to the first one, which is understanding your vendor master file. But I've shared 3 of the 9 key performance indicators I included in that blog. Now, the first one is the number or percentage of vendors that are total active. Now, you can use this KPI to indicate a need to inactivate vendors or identify normal spikes of activity based on the time of year. You can also use it as a business or in your business case to support a request for a vendor self-registration portal or some other automation tool that can help in the vendor process. The next one is the number or percentage of vendors that are 1099 or 1042 reportable. You want to identify these vendors and do an extra scrubbing right before tax time. It can also give you an idea of costs for forms or managed services if you want to outsource that service. You can also use it to determine whether you are over the threshold and must file electronically at the state or federal level when you're doing your 1099s with the IRS or with the state, and or determine the number of team members that are needed to process, to do that whole process annually. So the percentage of vendors 1099, 1042 reportable can be an important KPI to track. The last one that I've included here is the percentage or number of foreign vendors. Again, like I said, most of my clients say they don't have international vendors until they give me their vendor master file. And we do identify that there are foreign vendors or non-US vendors. So it really, this KPI identifies those vendors that need to be tracked for expiring W-8s, for example, or have invoices monitored to ensure coding is correct when distributing and filing those 1042s. And there are some other uses for it as well. And again, if you want to see the rest, and then I also have a link within that blog post to part 2, which is, it has 14 KPIs to understand your vendor request activity. So make sure you click through to get information on these KPIs I mentioned, and then to get more KPIs. All right, so we are going to, what did I do? Now we're ready for the bonus, and that is prevent occupational fraud. So I talk a lot about external fraud, but there is a real risk for occupational or internal fraud. So protect your vendor master file by monitoring it for occupational fraud. And to prevent it, have a process that checks the payroll records against vendor banking information, the tax ID, and the address to make sure that they do not match any employees on the payroll records. That can be an indicator of fraud. Now, you don't have to get access of the employee payroll records or their information in order to do that match. Work with IT or maybe with another group so that they can set this up to run in the background and then send a notification to management if there are ever any matches. Okay. So that was the last one, and that was the top 10 plus 1 bonus best practice for your vendor master file. Okay. Now, I do want to talk about, before we get to our Q&A session, here's some vendor team resources. Some I talked about, some I didn't. There are plenty of free resources on the left here, including the free vendor validation reference list that I have attached as a handout here. You can download it in the handout section. There's also a free desktop procedure template. So if you know you need to get those updated, go ahead and download the procedure template. I've got one that automatically updates the table of contents. I identify the recommended sections to include, so make sure you download that. I also have a free W-8 expiration date tracking form. So those of you that have foreign vendors, you know those W-8s expire 3 years, December 31st, the 3rd year after the date of the signature on the form. So there's a way to track that. And I also have plenty of live and on-demand webinars. Now, here is the discount code for 25% off the e-guide. The discount code is eGuide25, and again, you'll get 25% off of that. And I do want to talk about the vendor process team training pass that I have. If you enjoyed this webinar, I have weekly trainings that are the same thing, give you very valuable information, actionable items. The vendor process team training pass, there is one rate, whole team training solved. And so what's included with that is weekly Thursday live training sessions. I also have a weekly Q&A session where you can drop in, drop out, drop in, ask your question, drop off afterwards, or stick around and listen to other questions and answers. The Thursday live training sessions, the last Thursday of every month, I have a fraud training, which is new frauds and how to combat. The e-guide is included in there, as well as some of my other downloads, free templates and forms. And then the essential training series that I talked about earlier, going over the IRS W-9 examples, 10check.com validations, and a vendor process 4-hour workshop is also included. So make sure you check out my website for both free and paid resources. And then lastly, definitely connect with me, Twitter, LinkedIn. Here's a link for my podcast that I have. Again, I have 135 or so episodes. I also have a new YouTube channel where I post vendor master file tips of the week every Tuesday. So make sure you check that out, subscribe, and then hit the notification bell to be notified when I post a new one. My podcasts are also on YouTube as well, so you can listen to them there or on your favorite podcast platform. Okay. All right, so now we're at the Q&A session, and we've got about 11 minutes left. And I know I have at least one question. So the first one is, do we need to verify banking information if payments are handled by a third party? So I guess the question would be, is what is that third party doing? And so I know that there, especially in after what we went through last year, there are a lot of payment solution third-party providers out there. And the best ones that I have seen, they will completely handle your remit information. And so you don't even necessarily have to maintain the banking information in your ERP. They handle that as well. They will keep the remit information, including the banking, in their tool. And as a matter of fact, there is at least one that I know out there that if there is a fraudulent payment, they take the liability because they take the responsibility of collecting and storing accurate information. If your third-party provider that is making those payments has that type of feature, and they also take on the fraud liability, and so you're not liable for any fraudulent payments, then I would say you don't need to verify the banking information, and you probably should not retain it in your vendor master file if they're retaining it there. So it really takes you off the hook for risk, and if you remove it from your vendor master file, that's less of a risk too, because now you don't have to worry about access to that sensitive data in your vendor master file. But if you have a third-party provider where you're giving them a payment file with the banking information, then yes, and they're not covering you if they make a fraudulent payment. They're not really retaining that information in their tool, then yes, you still need to verify the banking information. And from what I understand with a lot of these third-party providers anyway, is they try to push them to cards so you don't have to worry about banking information. But the answer to that is you need to know what that third party, it depends on what the third party is providing. All right, so that was one. Does anyone else have any other questions? I don't see any there. One thing I do want to talk about, or I do want to say really quick, is for the watch list. I didn't say, well, actually two things. One, for the watch list, I know that most of you should be doing that and know you should be doing that at the time the vendor onboards. But what if that vendor, after they onboard, subsequently gets added to the list? And technically, you're not supposed to pay vendors that are on those exclusion lists. So if you have a pay cycle every day, every week, every 2 weeks, you need to do that that validation. Now, I know it can be hard for teams to do a validation every time they have a pay cycle. So I would suggest, if you don't have a third-party solution that's doing a continuous monitoring, and I know some of you do, but if you don't have that, I would suggest that you do that at least monthly, every 6 months. Every 6 months, or maybe quarterly at the latest. But you want to make sure that you do it in enough time that you haven't made too many payments or haven't made the next payment to a vendor that's on that list. And then monthly actually is the same recommendation I have for the second thing, which was the inactivating your vendors and just doing a cleanup of your vendor master file, because every month you have vendors that hit that 15, 18, or 24 month threshold. And so my recommendation is that you do that every month. In some systems, it can be automatic, so it's easy to schedule it every month. On other systems, it's a manual process, but monthly is what I recommend, quarterly, semi-annually, and at the very latest, annually, that should be done. Okay. All right, we have about 6 minutes left. Are there any other questions? Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through, so I am going to go ahead and end the webinar. Make sure if you do have any subsequent questions, the email address, my email address is here, that you can reach out to me after the webinar. It's Debra@DebraRRichardson.com. I want to thank everyone for joining me on the May monthly webinar, and make sure you check out my site for more upcoming webinars, as well as other free and paid resources. So thanks everyone. This webinar has now concluded.